The mountains had already turned dark when Caleb Turner finally returned to his cabin after a long day of trapping. The winter air had grown sharp and cold, and the snow beneath his boots crunched loudly in the quiet forest. Caleb pushed open the wooden door of his small cabin and stepped inside, shaking the snow from his coat. The fire in the stone hearth had nearly burned down to glowing coals. He knelt beside it and added 2 fresh logs. Soon the flames returned, filling the room with warm orange light. Caleb had lived alone in these mountains for almost 12 years. The world beyond the forest rarely reached him anymore. He cooked a simple dinner like he always did, rabbit stew with a small piece of bread. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. He sat down at the rough wooden table and lifted the spoon. Just as he took the first bite, there was a sound, a faint knock. Caleb froze. Out here, people did not knock on cabin doors in the mountains, not in winter. He slowly set the spoon down. The knock came again, softer this time. Caleb stood and reached for the rifle leaning beside the door. "Who's there?" he called. The wind answered first. Then a small voice spoke. "Sir, may we have your leftovers?" Caleb's hand tightened around the rifle. "May we?" The words meant more than one person. He opened the door slowly. The cold wind rushed inside. At first he saw nothing. Then 2 small figures stepped into the weak lantern light. 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy looked about 10, the girl maybe 7. They stood close together wearing coats that were far too thin for the mountain winter. Snow clung to their hair and boots. But it wasn't the cold that struck Caleb the hardest. It was their eyes. They were the eyes of children who had been hungry for far too long. The boy tried to stand straight like he was protecting his sister. "We don't need much," he said quietly. "Just whatever you were going to throw away." Caleb felt something inside his chest twist painfully. He had seen hardship before, but something about those eyes broke through the walls he had built around himself over the years. "Come inside," he said finally. The children hesitated like they weren't sure they had heard correctly. Caleb stepped aside. "Before you freeze." The boy nodded once and guided his sister into the cabin. The warmth of the fire hit them instantly. The little girl moved closer to the flames, holding her hands out carefully. Caleb returned to the table. He filled 2 bowls with stew and placed them down. The children stared at the food like it was something sacred. "You can eat," he told them softly. They didn't need to be told twice. They sat quickly and began eating. The girl's small hands shook as she held the spoon. Caleb sat across from them silently, watching. After a few minutes, the boy slowed down and looked up. "Thank you, sir." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "What are your names?" "Thomas," the boy said, pointing to himself. "And this is my sister, Lily." The girl gave a shy nod. Caleb studied them carefully. "Where are your parents?" Thomas's eyes dropped to the table. "They died last fall." The room fell quiet except for the crackling fire. Caleb spoke again. "How long have you been out here?" 3 days, Thomas answered. "We were heading south. Someone said there might be work in the valley." Caleb glanced toward the dark window. The valley was still 2 days away, even for a grown man. He looked back at the children. They were already exhausted. The girl finished her stew and fell half asleep in the chair. Caleb rubbed his beard slowly. He had spent years avoiding responsibility for anyone but himself. Life alone was easier. But those eyes. He stood and walked to the small storage shelf. He pulled out blankets and placed them near the fire. "You 2 can sleep here tonight," he said. Thomas immediately shook his head. "We don't want to cause trouble." Caleb gave him a firm look. "It's not trouble." The boy hesitated before finally nodding. Lily was already asleep before the blanket fully covered her. Thomas remained awake a little longer. "We'll leave early," he promised quietly. Caleb sat back down near the fire. "We'll talk in the morning." Soon the cabin fell silent again. But Caleb didn't sleep. He watched the 2 children resting beside the fire and felt memories he had buried years ago begin to surface. He had once had a family too, a wife, a small daughter. Winter's sickness had taken them both long ago. Since then, he had chosen the mountains over people. It hurt less that way. But tonight, something had changed. The little girl stirred in her sleep and whispered one word, "Papa." The sound hit Caleb harder than anything else. He looked away toward the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames. For the first time in 12 long years, the mountain man felt the weight of loneliness crack open inside him. And he realized something he had not expected when he opened the cabin door tonight. He might not be able to send these children away anymore. The thought stayed with Caleb long after the fire had burned low. The wind outside pressed against the cabin walls like a restless spirit, but inside the room felt warmer than it had in years. He looked at the two small shapes sleeping beside the hearth. Lily was curled under the blanket, her tiny hand still clutching the edge of the bowl she had finished earlier. Thomas slept lightly beside her, as if even in rest he felt responsible for protecting his sister. Caleb leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. He had lived alone in these mountains for 12 years. He had told himself he preferred the silence. No arguments, no grief, no memories. But now two children were breathing softly in the same room, and the silence felt different. Morning came slowly, with pale winter light creeping through the frosted window. Caleb rose early as usual and stepped outside. The cold air bit into his lungs. The mountains stretched wide and quiet beneath a blanket of snow. He chopped wood for the fire, fed the mule in the small shed, and checked his traps along the nearby ridge. When he returned to the cabin, the smell of smoke filled the air. Inside, Thomas stood near the hearth, trying to add another log to the fire. Lily sat at the table, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Morning," Caleb said. The boy straightened quickly. "Good morning, sir." Lily smiled shyly. Caleb placed a small sack of flour and dried meat on the table. "Breakfast." Thomas looked surprised. "You didn't have to give us more food." Caleb shrugged. "Hungry children don't travel far." They ate quietly, the warmth of the cabin slowly pushing away the cold of the night. After a while, Thomas spoke again. "We should leave soon." Caleb looked up. "Why?" The boy hesitated. "You helped us already. We can't stay." Lily's face fell slightly, but she stayed silent. Caleb leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. "The valley is 2 days south," he said. "In this snow, maybe 3. Thomas nodded. "We know." "You won't make it." The words hung in the room. Thomas looked down at the table. Caleb continued, "You can stay here a while, until the weather clears." The boy looked up slowly. "Are you sure?" Caleb gave a short nod. Lily's small smile returned like sunlight breaking through clouds. The days that followed were different from anything Caleb had experienced in years. The cabin filled with quiet life. Lily followed him everywhere, asking endless, curious questions about the forest and the animals. Thomas worked hard without being asked. He carried wood, fetched water from the stream, and helped repair the old fence near the shed. Caleb watched the boy carefully. Thomas was young but carried himself like someone who had grown up too quickly. One evening, while they sat by the fire, Caleb asked gently, "Where did you two come from before the mountains?" Thomas stared into the flames. "A small town east of here. Our father worked in the mines. And after he died, the mine owners took the house." Thomas's voice stayed calm, but his hands tightened. "Some neighbors helped for a while, then winter came." Caleb didn't ask more. He understood enough. But peace rarely lasted long in the wilderness. One afternoon, Caleb spotted movement through the trees near the ridge. He stepped outside and narrowed his eyes. 2 men on horseback were riding slowly toward the cabin. Strangers. Caleb felt his muscles tighten. He had seen men like them before, drifters who hunted more than animals. He walked back inside. "Thomas," he said quietly, "take Lily into the back room." The boy's eyes widened. "Why?" "Just do it." Thomas quickly took his sister's hand and led her behind the cabin door. Moments later, the riders arrived. They dismounted casually and approached the porch. The taller man knocked once before pushing the door open. Caleb stood waiting near the table. "Afternoon," the man said with a crooked grin. "Afternoon," Caleb replied coldly. The second man looked around the cabin. "We're tracking two children, boy and a girl, came through these mountains." Caleb's face remained calm. "Lots of people pass through." The tall man stepped closer. "Town sheriff says they ran away after their parents died. There's money for bringing them back." Caleb studied their faces carefully. Men hunting children for money rarely had good intentions. "Haven't seen them," he said finally. The two men exchanged looks. One of them stepped toward the back hallway. Caleb's hand moved slowly to the rifle leaning against the wall. The tall man noticed immediately. He raised his hands with a fake smile. "No need for trouble, mountain man." Caleb's voice dropped low. "Then leave." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the men backed toward the door. "If you see them," the tall one said, "you might want to remember that reward." They mounted their horses and rode away into the trees. Caleb waited until the sound of hooves disappeared before lowering the rifle. The back door creaked open slowly. Thomas stepped out with Lily behind him. "Were they looking for us?" Caleb nodded once. The boy swallowed nervously. "Are they coming back?" Caleb looked at the quiet forest beyond the window. "Maybe." Lily clutched Thomas's sleeve. "We don't want to leave again." Caleb studied the two frightened faces standing in his cabin. He remembered the emptiness of the past 12 years, the silent meals, the cold winters alone. Then he spoke the words that surprised even himself. "You won't have to." Thomas blinked. "What do you mean?" Caleb leaned his rifle against the wall. "It means you can stay here." Lily's eyes widened. "Forever?" Caleb hesitated only a moment. "If you want." The little girl ran forward and hugged him before he could react. Caleb froze for a second, then slowly placed a careful hand on her shoulder. Thomas stood nearby, his eyes shining with quiet relief. Outside, snow began to fall again across the mountains. But inside the small cabin, the fire burned brighter than ever. For the first time since losing his own family, Caleb Turner no longer felt like the loneliest man in the mountains. And the two hungry children who had asked only for leftovers had unknowingly given him something he thought he had lost forever: a family.